Welcome to the next part of these podcasts. I'm John Moffatt from the Heathrop Institute at the London Jesuit Centre. The book of Genesis took Jacob's household to Egypt to be rescued, thanks to Joseph. But Exodus begins in crisis. The household has now become a large tribe and is perceived as an alien threat to the Egyptian way of life. The Egyptians create a savagely hostile environment. But God takes a saving initiative. As often in the Old Testament, a crucial rescuer role is played by a woman. It is Miriam, Moses' sister, who sees to it that her little brother is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and suckled by his own mother. God then singles out Moses as a mediator, not only to mediate God's work of rescue, but to help the people relearn who their God is and what that God is about. Moses himself has to rediscover a living relationship with God on the mountainside as I am who am, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses has the help of his brother Aaron, the priest, and Miriam, his sister, and later also Joshua, the warrior. Together, they will lead the people to safety and through the desert to the edge of the promised land. But in this narrative, it is God who rescues. God who intimidates the Egyptians with the plagues. God who divides the waters. God who overwhelms the Egyptian forces, with Miriam leading the song of triumph. It is God who gives food and water to the people in the desert. The great act of rescue then leads to the high point of the theological narrative of Exodus, where God speaks directly to the people from Mount Sinai. God reveals God's self to them as the one who rescued them from Egypt, and then speaks the words of the 10 Commandments. God's word creates his people. This climactic moment terrifies them. They tell Moses to go up the mountain alone, on their behalf, to learn the detail of the law, of which the 10 Commandments turn out to be a sort of summary. We, the readers, learn the detail of the law in the Book of the Covenant. Moses then returns, and we enter the scene we discussed last time. The people hear and accept the terms of the covenant, and the covenant is sealed with a sacrifice and the sprinkling of the blood of the covenant. The books of Exodus through to Deuteronomy, as we saw, most probably find their final form towards the end of the 6th century, during and after the Babylonian exile. They draw on ancient tribal legends and fragments of legal traditions and earlier layers of composition inherited from the 2 Hebrew kingdoms conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They emphasize a very immediate relationship between God and the people. Stormy at times, but immediate. Everyone sees the pillar of fire and cloud, along with the signs and wonders. Other older writings of the Old Testament can help us make sense of this way of reading history, as closely guided by the hand of God. The words of the prophet Hosea, like those of 1st Isaiah and Amos, most probably date from the 8th century. They are contemporary with the disastrous invasions by the Assyrians, which destroyed the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. Hosea sees the Lord at work in contemporary and ancient history. His words hark back to the folk memory of a migration from Egypt and a period of wandering in the desert. Speaking in the voice of God, Hosea interprets the legend of the wandering as a time when God wooed and won his people, like a man wooing his future wife. Hosea then contrasts that time of primal innocence with the life of the people under the current regime. Rulers live in luxury and lord it over the poor and the labourers. But above all, people are worshipping other gods, the gods of the surrounding peoples, and performing their rituals. It is religious adultery. This gives us an important theme which shapes the retelling of the legends of the Exodus and the following narrative history of the 2 kingdoms. The covenant can fall into jeopardy if the people, and above all their leaders, fail to be faithful to the Lord alone and fail to practice the social justice and religious observances that go with the covenant. This, then, is where we can see part of the role of the prophet at work. Whether we look at the historical Amos and Hosea, or the more legendary Elijah and Elisha, the prophets stand up and call the leadership to order, and declare God's judgment on them if they fail to respond. Nevertheless, even in the midst of such denunciation, there remains the seed of hope. Judgment may fall in this moment of history on these particular rulers. However, God will continue to uphold and protect his people, and will choose someone, a rescuer, to do so on his behalf. So here is another important variation on the theme of covenant and promise that emerges after Exodus and Deuteronomy, in the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It is this variation that underpins the hope of the Messiah, central to Christian belief, and still significant for many groups in modern Judaism. It is the promise of a Messiah, an anointed ruler who will save the people. Let's now see how these theological themes developed by the prophets play out in the historical narrative. The Exodus covenant is a bipartisan deal. On the one hand, the people and their leaders promise to keep their side of the bargain and keep the terms of the covenant. In this context, the role of the prophet, from Moses through to Hosea and beyond, is to speak up and call people to order when they backslide from the purity and holiness of the idealized way of life of faithfulness to the Lord. But on the other side is the Lord's promise to give the people a land and to protect them from their enemies. In Exodus, it is God who leads the people out of Egypt with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. But in later generations, God rescues his people through intermediaries. The first of these leaders is Joshua, whose very name captures the sense of his mission. It means the Lord saves, and it is the Hebrew form of the Aramaic name Yeshua, which we know from its Greek form as Jesus. Joshua famously leads the people over the Jordan and into the Promised Land, where they conquer their enemies, and the different Hebrew tribes settle in different regions. It is important to hold at the back of our minds that at this point in the narrative, the storytelling is still in a time of legends. Archaeologists will tell you that the physical evidence from this period, which would be round about the 13th or 12th century BC, actually points to a more gradual and less combative pattern of settlement. Nevertheless, in the unfolding history that follows, we meet a series of people titled Judges, who rise up and perform the role of rescuers. Names like Gideon and Samson are familiar. Among them is Deborah, the female prophet and judge, another woman who is an agent of God's rescue for his people. The judges defend the people in the loose federation of Hebrew territories as local threats and crises emerge, particularly with the arrival of a new hostile people on the coast, the Philistines. At the end of this sequence, however, comes the short story of Ruth, which is a trailer for the story of David. Ruth is a foreign woman who chooses to stay with her mother-in-law Naomi when her husband dies. She commits herself in faithfulness not just to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. This faithful foreigner will eventually marry Boaz and become the grandmother of David, the king with a special relationship with the Lord. Now we are close to the border between legend and historical time, when elements of the story begin to match up more closely with the archaeological record. The books of Samuel describe the end of the period of Judges and the beginnings of the Hebrew kingdoms. They begin with the story of the God-given birth of Samuel, a prophet, and the last of Judges. Once again, a woman plays a key role at the beginning of the story. It is Samuel's mother, Hannah, who is barren and prays at the shrine of the Lord for a child. When her prayer is answered, she gives the child to the service of the Lord and sings a song of triumph that is deliberately echoed in the Song of Mary in Luke's Gospel. Samuel leads a religious renewal and defends the people against the Philistines, until the people come to him and ask for a king like other nations. We now see a new role for the prophet, as one who is sent by God to choose and consecrate the king. Samuel anoints first Saul, and then, when Saul displeases God, David, as kings of a Hebrew kingdom that eventually stretches from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. By the way, the narratives here are multi-layered and subtle. There are no illusions about the complex characters of kings, however favoured by God. In fact, David's reign ends in chaos and scarce contained revolution. Nevertheless, at a central point in the story, he receives that crucial promise through Nathan the prophet, so significant for later messianic hopes, that a son of his will always sit upon the throne in Jerusalem. The first book of Kings begins by showing that promise in action. Solomon, David's son by Bathsheba, reigns nobly in Jerusalem. The narrative, however, though it begins by emphasizing Solomon's wisdom, ends with a description of his failure as he introduces foreign religious cults. That pattern and its consequences will dominate the subsequent narrative of the kings, picking up theological themes which have been signposted all the way from the book of Deuteronomy. There, Moses gave the people an existential choice between following or abandoning the terms of the covenant. See, today I set before you life and prosperity, death and disaster. The books of Kings take us on the journey towards that tragic conclusion. The first sign that things are going wrong is the splitting of Solomon's kingdom into two after his death, into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The heir of David will indeed rule in Jerusalem in Judah, but over a much reduced domain. The movement is not all one way. The failure by the northern rulers of Israel to live up to the social and religious demands of the covenant is successfully challenged by prophetic figures like Elijah and Elisha. The steady decline from a primal purity is punctuated by occasional patches of religious renewal under good kings, the heirs of David in the kingdom of Judah. But the story ends with real historical disasters. First, the capture of the kingdom of Israel or Samaria in 722 by the Syrians, and finally, the capture of Jerusalem, the deportation of the nobility and destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 598 and 587 BC. The final compilers of these texts thread the narrative through with their theological judgment. This all happened because the leaders failed to keep to the terms of the covenant. And yet, this catalogue of disasters ends with a shred of comfort, a small but significant spark of hope, drawn from the lived experience of those who knew the Babylonian exile. The last king of Judah, Jehoiakim, an heir of David, is not killed. He lives on, and even becomes an honoured guest at the Babylonian court. In spite of the disaster and the apparent failure of the covenant, a momentous piece of the positive theological narrative is preserved. Here we have a powerful idea central to later hopes for a Messiah. The covenant and the promise live on in the person of the King. The hope that God will rescue his people lives on because the Son of David is still alive. Matthew will make that connection right at the beginning of his Gospel, when he traces the genealogy of Jesus from Abraham through Jehoiakim, the last of the kings of Judah, and Zerubbabel his grandson, and the first of those to return from exile to rebuild Jerusalem. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.